Thank you. I'm only a critic because I love YUI. So my name's Ryan Grove. You can tell because it says so on that slide. How many of you are morning people? All right, so everybody else, beat up those people after my talk, because this is an unreasonable hour for anybody to give a talk. Anyway, so that's me. I know a lot of you, but some of you I've never met, so I'll introduce myself. I work at a company called SmugMug, and if you haven't heard of us, SmugMug is an awesome photo sharing website for amateur and professional photographers. I joined SmugMug back in May, but they've actually been using YUI for years, since long before I joined, since the YUI 2 days. Before I joined SmugMug, I worked at Yahoo for 5 years, 2 of which were on the YUI team. So I worked on YUI components like autocomplete, history, model list, router, view, lots of stuff. I helped build the YUI website. I gave as few talks as possible because I hate giving talks. But yeah, so before that, I was a model for a Japanese clothing catalog. Believe it or not, that's actually me. I was a little bit younger back then. So here are some things that I like. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about everything that I like today. I would love to, because this is the stuff that I really care about. But today we're going to talk about YUI. And YUI is a pretty big topic too, so specifically I'm going to focus on when not to use YUI. And I know that I just said that I really like YUI, so why would I tell you not to use it? Well, I think we should take a step back and talk a little bit about what libraries are for. So a library is something that saves you time. It might save you time by ensuring that you don't have to write frequently used code over and over again. It might save you time by doing something that would be a real headache for you to do yourself. It might save you time by just doing something that you would rather not have to implement on your own. Maybe it's not that hard, but maybe you'd just rather not have to do it. Whatever the reason for using a library, the point of a library is to do certain things for you so that you can concentrate on other things. And that's a really good thing, because when a library does that stuff for you, you can concentrate on that other stuff that's more meaningful to your app. Instead of worrying about the foundational stuff, instead of worrying about the stuff that you always have to do every single time, you can worry about the specific things that make your application, whatever it is that you're building, interesting and useful. So in short, libraries are powerful tools that can help you do your job faster and better and more efficiently. Now, a library has to be generic enough so that it's useful to a lot of people, because everybody's doing different things with it. But if a library is too generic, then it's not really useful to anybody. So it's sort of about finding that sweet spot where it's going to do the most good for the most people and the least bad for the most people. But it's never quite going to be perfect for everybody. So the best libraries, like the best tools, do one thing well so that they can focus on that one thing and get it right. But we're talking about YUI, which does a lot of things. So where does that fit in? So pedantic people have been pointing out for years that the YUI library is not actually a library. It's a framework. And in fact, if you want to break it down further, it's not really about UI. So really the only part of that name that makes sense is the Y for Yahoo. Although they just changed that, so it's now more kind of an open governance model, which is really cool. So really the entire name is just a lie. But I don't think it's going to change anytime soon, and we're here at YUIConf, so we might as well stick with it. So anyway, YUI is a framework, and a framework, at least for the purposes of this talk, is a collection of like-minded libraries that work together to accomplish a variety of tasks. So in YUI, you've got tools for working with the DOM. You've got tools for managing classes and creating class hierarchies. You've got low-level language abstractions and high-level widgets and tools for working on the server and on mobile, on desktop. So basically, you've got this big fat toolbox full of tools. And that's really great because it means that chances are, if you're doing something with JavaScript, YUI can probably help you do it. There's probably something in the library that you can use that'll be useful to you. But just like a toolbox, you're never going to want to use every tool just because you have every tool. So just because YUI can do all of these wonderful, useful things doesn't mean that you should always use all of YUI, or that just because a tool exists, you should always use that tool. So when you're unscrewing a screw and you're using a screwdriver, and you get to that point where you stop using the screwdriver and you switch to your fingers, you kind of do that naturally. You sort of have this inherent knowledge of like, oh, the screw's loose enough, now I can just use my fingers to get the rest of the way. And you switch because it's not because your fingers are a better tool for removing a screw. It's because at a certain point, the screwdriver, which is purposely designed for that one task, actually becomes a little bit less efficient than your own hand, which is a much more generic tool. But there's a point where it's a better one. So it's really easy to start depending on YUI for a lot of stuff just because it's there. And that's your brain leading you into a trap. You shouldn't just depend on YUI. You should take advantage of it when it makes sense. But there's sort of a situation that develops when you're using YUI in your app and you've already loaded it on the page and you spend a bunch of time learning how to use it and you've built out a bunch of code that uses YUI. You sort of fall into this trap of just using YUI for everything just because it's comfortable and it's there and you like it. And you've grown accustomed to it. But if you think of YUI the same way you think of your toolbox, your physical toolbox, you wouldn't use a screwdriver when it doesn't make sense to use a screwdriver, right? You wouldn't use a hammer when it doesn't make sense to use a hammer. You don't really think twice about that. You look at your toolbox and you think, what's the right tool for pounding in this nail, or what's the right tool for removing this screw? You're not attached to those tools in a way that makes you want to use them all the time for everything. And you really shouldn't be attached to YUI that way either. So understanding the trade-offs that you're making when you use YUI or any other library or any tool, that's really the key to being efficient with those tools. Understanding the trade-offs means that you need to understand at least a little bit about what's going on under the hood. So you can't just be lazy and you can't just sit back and expect the library to be magical. You can't treat it like a black box. So you need to do some research occasionally. And you need to be curious. You need to open up the source and peek under the hood and look at what the library is doing. And you'll find that sometimes it does a lot of great stuff for you. Sometimes you'll look under the hood and you'll realize you're totally happy with it. Everything that it's doing is awesome. Everything that it's doing is something that you need. Sometimes you'll look under the hood and you'll be horrified and you'll be like, wait, this is not doing at all what I expected. This is doing a bunch of stuff that I don't need it to do, or what it's doing is not what I thought it was doing. It's actually doing something a little different. And that's what being curious can give you. It can give you that insight into what this tool that you're using is actually doing. So ultimately, it comes down to one thing. If you're able to do something with plain old JavaScript without using YUI or without using another library, and it's not going to waste development time, and it's not going to create duplicate code, and you're not going to be reinventing the wheel. If it's easy, just use JavaScript. Don't use a library just because you've got a library. So that's your philosophy lesson. But I want to get into some real practical examples of when not to use YUI. And I want to stress that when I or anybody else says don't do this, it's an opinion, it's advice. So by all means, disobey me. I'm just sharing what I think. So people who have different opinions are certainly going to think differently, and that's fine. I think we should encourage that. So we'll start simple. YUI has a y.lang namespace that has a lot of really helpful utility methods for doing things like checking the type of a variable. And it's got some other stuff too for like, lang.sub can do string substitution, things like that. That's pretty useful. Most of the type checking methods are actually pretty useless. And if you look under the hood, you'll see this. So I want to show you some of them. Here's isBoolean. This tells you whether or not a value is true or false. That's all it does. And you incur a performance cost for calling isBoolean. But if you look under the hood, you'll see all it's doing is type of value triple equals Boolean. You could do this yourself in your own code. It's only in YUI for completeness. It's only in YUI to complete an API. And it's easy to say, well, it's there, so I'll use it because it must be there for a reason. But there's a cost for using it, and you need to be aware of that. IsFunction has a pretty big cost, actually. It's also doing a type of check, and then it does some other stuff. It does some logic that really is only necessary in some edge cases that you're probably never going to encounter. And it makes things a lot slower. IsNull for checking whether something is null. Just does value triple equals null. You can do this yourself without calling a function. IsString just does type of value equals string. There's nothing special there. YUI is not saving you from anything. It's just completing an API. IsUndefined. Type of value triple equals undefined. You can do this yourself. So the performance difference that you see here is essentially, in most cases, the overhead of calling a function. It's just function call overhead to do something that you could have done in line. And in some browsers, that's not a big deal. So like you can see, Chrome is almost always, whatever. In other browsers, it is kind of a big deal. iOS 6, it becomes a big deal. IE 9, actually, I should point out here, IE, you probably shouldn't compare too heavily with the other browsers on this slide because I tested it in a VM. So it's OK to compare its numbers with itself, but I wouldn't use this slide as evidence of, IE is super, super slow. I mean, it is slow, but it's not quite as slow as it looks like it is. So, the point is, these things seem like they're doing something useful, but they're actually not. There are a few methods that do useful things, but you probably don't need them. They're useful in only certain circumstances. IsNumber does a type of check, and then it also checks whether the number is finite. So unless you know that you're working with infinity or that you might get a value that equals infinity, you probably don't need to use IsNumber. IsObject returns true for both objects and functions. So if you don't care about that, you can just do type of value equals object or type of value equals function. And then there are some that actually do some useful stuff. IsArray, IsDate, IsValue. These do things like cross-browser consistency issues. IsValue does a number of checks that it would be pointless to duplicate in your own code. So these are pretty useful. And it probably makes sense to use these if you need to do what it is that they're doing. There's another method on YUI, on the core object, that I see people use a lot. And there is never a case where you need to use this. This method actually exists for one reason. There's one place in YUI when it sets up the global YUI instance where it needs to pass in a value that could end up being the global object, the window. And it turns out there's apparently a memory leak in older versions of IE if you do an instance of check on the window or the document. So YUI has this method that accounts for that memory leak in that one specific circumstance. But you're never going to encounter this. You are never going to do an instance of check that's going to pass in the window or the document. There's no reason to do that. So there's no reason to use this. It incurs a big cost, and it covers a very, very narrow edge case that almost certainly does not apply to you. But people see it on the API, and they think, it's there for a reason. It must be safer than the native instance of operator, so I'll go ahead and use it. And that's not your fault. This is something that I think can be, it's a situation that can be avoided with documentation that's clearer. And the documentation, to its credit, does tell you what the edge case is, but I think it could be more explicit about how rarely you should need to use this. So those are some small examples. But I do want to go after some big fish. And there's one really big fish in YUI, and that's y.base. So y.base is one of the most useful foundation classes in the library. And you can tell that that's the case because everything uses it. If you haven't used it before, y.base is just a foundational class that gives you a lot of functionality, like it gives you initializer and destructor functions so you can manage the life cycle of your class. It automatically gives you built-in support for attributes, built-in support for custom events, and when you create a subclass hierarchy, it aggregates the attributes up that hierarchy. So if you saw Luke Smith's talk yesterday where he was talking about attribute, he kind of touched on some of this, specifically the attribute aggregation. So this is all really useful stuff. And there's also some sugar. If you use base.create, it helps you create your classes. So it takes care of creating your constructor function for you and chaining the constructor to its superclass. It gives you some nice sugar for mixing in extension classes. So it's really handy, and it's really easy to use, and it's really tempting to use, but there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So all that awesome functionality is really useful, and it's really awesome, but it has a cost, and you need to be aware of that cost. So I benchmarked creating an instance of base versus just creating an instance of a vanilla JavaScript function. And this looks really scary because the difference is so huge that if I use percentages to try to explain it, base is virtually 100% slower all the time. So if I use absolute numbers, it's easier to talk about it. So if you look at Chrome, for example, 11,000 instantiations per second for base is actually a pretty good number. That's, if you can do something 11,000 times a second, that's not what I would call slow in absolute terms, until you compare it to a vanilla JavaScript constructor, and you get 4 million instantiations per second. Now, I wouldn't freak out about this, because this comparison is literally doing nothing. My JavaScript constructor is doing nothing at all. My base class is doing nothing at all except what base is doing under the hood. But the interesting thing is that this is the cost that you incur as a baseline before any of your own code runs, before your implementation, whatever it is that you're building on top of this, before that even enters into the picture, this is the cost that you've incurred. But execution speed isn't the only thing that you need to worry about. Despite what Doug Crockford said yesterday, you do need to think about memory usage. This does come up. Base clocks in at about 2 kilobytes per instance. So if you can think of creating 1,000 instances of base, that's going to end up being about 2 megabytes of RAM. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but that's before you've built any of your own stuff on top of it. And you compare that to a vanilla JavaScript function, 12 bytes per instance. That's bytes, not kilobytes. And that's because this vanilla instance, this JavaScript instance, doesn't have to recreate everything for each instance. It just has one prototype on the constructor, and that's where everything lives. That's where all your methods and your properties, everything that lives on the prototype lives there. And so each instance is just a tiny, tiny little thing that in most cases just chains back to the prototype object. So you can get 1,000 vanilla JavaScript instances for the cost of about 6 base instances. And that's not a trivial difference, especially for mobile devices with limited memory, for older machines. And since Y.base is a foundational component, even if you yourself have never knowingly used base, you're probably using it, even if you don't realize it, because so many things use it under the hood. These are some of the components in YUI that extend base. So I'm not saying that these classes shouldn't extend base, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't use these classes, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't use base. The reason I'm showing you this list is because I want to stress the point that you need to understand the costs of what you're using, and you need to understand the context in which you're using these things. Sometimes the benefits outweigh the costs. If I'm going to create one instance of a widget that uses base, no big deal. That's a cost that it totally makes sense to pay. If I'm going to create 1,000 instances of something, that's a cost that I would need to think more carefully about. So when is it worth it to use base? When you need attributes, when you need events, when you need the lifecycle management, and when you need extensions, or are likely to need extensions. So if your answer to any one of these things is, I don't need that, or I'm not sure if I need that, then you should probably think pretty critically about whether or not you should use base. If you only need attributes, you can just use Y.attribute. If you only need custom events, you can just use event target. if you only need lifecycle management, you can do that yourself without too much code if it's a performance critical situation. So think carefully about what you need and what parts of base you're using before you extend the entire thing and incur all that cost. But the most important thing to consider is how many instances of this thing you'll be creating. How many of these things will live side by side on the same page. If you only need a few instances, probably not a big deal to use base. If you need thousands, like I said, performance is at some point going to become a problem for you. But who really needs 1,000 instances of something? I think Doug mentioned this yesterday in his talk as well. Nobody ever creates thousands of instances of something in JavaScript. That's silly. Yeah, actually, if you use model and view, you could easily end up with thousands of instances of something. So if you're using model to represent database rows, or if you're using view to render those models, if you're not careful, you can easily end up with thousands of instances. And these use base under the hood. They were on that list that I showed you earlier. So why do model and view use base? I would like to point at one of you and blame it on you, but actually it's my fault. So when I wrote them, even though I was aware of the cost, even though I had benchmarked base, and it was something that I was thinking about as I was writing these things, I banked too much on the value that I thought I was getting out of it, and I banked too much on promises of future performance improvements, which you may also have heard some of yesterday. But I would caution you, don't believe anybody who promises you that something is going to get faster without you doing anything. They might be telling the truth, but you can't trust that. Things rarely just get faster magically. That's not something that you can bank on. So because I was too focused on doing things the YUI way, and because I had gotten my benefit versus cost balance out of whack when I designed these things, I don't think I made the right decision. And that's my fault, and hindsight is 20/20, so I'm sorry about that. But if it makes you feel any better, I'm actually dealing with the consequences of this myself now. So I'm on the other side, and now I have to use the code that I created. Back in May, as I said, I left Yahoo and I joined SmugMug. SmugMug is probably the single heaviest user of model and view that I know of in the world. They were using them right out of the gate before these things were even officially released. And to their credit, they've built a wonderfully usable developer API, so that developers can be really efficient with the things that we've built on top of these foundation classes. But the problem is performance starts to suffer. So when you do a search on SmugMug, you get this gorgeous search result page. It's just wall-to-wall images. And as you scroll down, more results are loaded automatically. It's just infinitely more and more results. You can click on an image after you've scrolled. It'll remember where you were. You click the back button, it brings you back where you were without having to re-scroll through all those images. It's a really, it's a nice experience. When you're hunting for a beautiful image, you don't want to have to deal with a bunch of UI chrome and pagination crap. So it's a fantastic experience in theory. Shortly after this launched, users started complaining. They started saying that it was bogging down their computers. And as they scrolled down through a few hundred images, things would get slower and slower, and in some cases, their browsers became unresponsive. Some of them even had their browsers crash. So it wasn't as good as we thought it was. And when SmugMug hired me, one of the first things they did was show me this. And they told me about the feedback that they'd been hearing. And obviously, the first thing I thought was, oh, crap. There's probably a bunch of models and views in there. This is probably my fault. Look at this mess I've gotten myself into. So, I wanted to get to the bottom of the problem. And sure enough, it was right. There were tons of models and views. So each image on this page is represented by a model and rendered by a view. So if you have 100 images on the page, you have 100 models and 100 views. And since the page scrolls infinitely, as you scroll down more and more, you get more and more models and more views. And this particular page has an interaction where users are very likely to scroll down to potentially thousands of images because they're searching for that one image that they want to find. So needless to say, this eats up tons of CPU. It eats up tons of memory. And not only were those model and view instances consuming RAM, but you also have to think about the DOM elements that are actually rendering these things on the page, the image data that has to sit in memory for each image on the page. This is all taking up memory. And so this worked OK in Google Chrome on our Mac Pro desktops with 16 gigs of RAM, but not everybody has a Mac Pro desktop with 16 gigs of RAM, and not everybody uses Google Chrome. So when our users running IE8 on their ancient, crappy Windows laptops were searching for photos, it was unusable, and they were miserable, and they hated it. And to make matters worse, it turns out even when we tried to clean up after ourselves, even when we tried to say, like, as you scroll down, we'll remove unused models and views, we'll destroy them, we'll clean up the memory, it turns out YUI was leaking memory. There was a leak in the event system that was holding on to objects that had been passed through event facades, and so they weren't being garbage collected. So we ended up duck punching YUI to fix this, but the good news is it's been fixed in core. So I think in 3.7, that issue was fixed, so you don't need to worry about that anymore. After we tackled the memory leaks, the next thing we did was we changed the way that we rendered image tiles. So instead of having a view per tile, we just created one big view for the entire set of results. And we render the results one at a time within this big view in sort of blocks of 50, but we're not incurring that cost of a view instance for each result, because that wasn't really buying us anything. And we found one of the other costs that we were paying was just responding to scroll events as the user scrolled down. That can actually get pretty expensive, because scroll events fire really frequently, and there's a lot of work that you have to do to calculate metrics, to calculate where you are in the viewport. So we wrote a plugin for this. You can plug it into any y.node instance, and as that node is scrolled, whether it's the body or any other node, you get a throttled scroll event for it. So it's not going to fire every single time the browser scroll event fires. It only fires every 50 or 100 or 200 milliseconds. So it gives you efficiently gathered metrics on the scroll position. It caches things pretty smartly. And it also tells you which nodes on the page are currently visible within the viewport. So this allowed us to say, well, if the user only sees 50 images within the viewport, then the 1,000 images that are up here, we can just hide those. And now the browser doesn't have to worry about them. So as they're scrolling, it actually gets more responsive. And we contributed this back to YUI. So it's in YUI now as of 3.7. So you can use this in your own stuff. So that took care of our view problem. But we still had thousands of models on the page. And we didn't want to stop using model and model list because it was really useful. Particularly, model list was useful for us because we're using it to do pagination and to make API requests and load new images as we scroll. But as it turns out, we weren't actually using most of models functionality. Because once a result is loaded, it doesn't change. There's no point using a model that has attributes and change events and validation and save and load functionality for something that isn't going to change once it's loaded. So we wrote a thing called lazy model list, and it gives you the exact same API as model list, but it manages a list of vanilla JavaScript objects instead of a list of model instances. So if you need a full-fledged model, you can revive it from the list, and you get an instance of model, and you can use that however you want. And then when you're done with it, you can free it. And the data still lives in the list. You can get it back if you want it, but you're not creating thousands of model instances. So we contributed this back to YUI as well. It's in 3.6, so you can use this. And the performance benefits that we saw were pretty significant. So not only did the interface feel much more responsive, but in raw numbers, we saw improvements in the initial rendering time of the page. We saw improvements in the time that it takes to manually scroll to the 1,000th result. And the biggest difference was memory usage. After 1,000 items on the page, we were using 63% less memory than we were before. And in addition to that, the memory that we were using increased much more slowly as you loaded more images. So even in IE8 on an ancient Windows laptop, this interface was still pretty beautiful, and it was still really responsive, and it wasn't crashing people's browsers anymore. So this got me thinking. It got me thinking about taking a different approach to building YUI components. And over the last few months, I've built a number of components for SmugMug that basically throw out the old rulebook. Before I reach for a YUI class or a utility method, I think about it and I ask myself, what it's really buying me and at what cost. And am I doing this because it's the right way, or am I doing this because it's the YUI way? And I try to think critically about that. I try not to be too attached to YUI just because I like it. And this has led me in some interesting directions. So one of the things I found myself needing was templates. And I needed some really simple templates to handle some HTML for some simple widgets. So y.lang.sub, which does string substitution, wasn't quite as good as what I needed. I needed a little bit more than just substitution. Handlebars I could have used, but it did a lot more than I needed. And it incurs a page weight cost. It's fairly heavy. So I really wanted something in between, but there wasn't anything like that in YUI. So I started looking at underscore.js. Underscore templates are super simple. It's a really simple implementation. It's really fast. It did exactly what I needed, but I didn't want to load all of underscore just so I could use templates, because I've already got YUI on the page. So instead, I wrote something similar to bring underscore style templates to YUI. So it's called template.micro, and it weighs in at about 50 lines of code, minus comments. And it significantly outperforms handlebars, and it's even a little bit faster than underscore. And it's a nice, lightweight templating solution for when you need to do something that's just sort of in that Goldilocks area between string substitution and a full-fledged template language like handlebars. And this actually just went into YUI in 3.8 PR1, so you can use this now as well. So next, I found myself having to develop a tree view widget for SmugMug. And I was a little worried about this because, as some of you may know, tree view has been something that YUI users have wanted for years, and it's been something that has been in development for years and has never quite made it into YUI. And there are a bunch of tree view widgets in the gallery. Some of you may be using them. And I looked at those, because obviously why rewrite something when there's existing code? And the problem is, for the most part, they try to do things the YUI way. And this is why none of them is really very good, unfortunately. Because the YUI way is to use widget parent and widget child to manage node instances, manage your tree nodes within the tree. Or at a minimum, use y.base and allow the instances to have attributes and change events and things like that, because that's super useful. That's what you want. But it turns out that's really, really bad for performance. I mean, you've got a tree that's got thousands of nodes. That's awful. We're back to that situation I described before with models and views. So I decided, sure, I'm going to write this tree view. It's not going to use base for nodes. And my first thought was I'll use a model list, or I'll use a lazy model list to store this node data. And then I realized I was still thinking in the YUI way. Even though I had created this lazy model list that was more performant, that still wasn't the right thing to use for a tree. Lazy model list and model list, they're great for representing lists of things, flat lists of items. But a tree, it's not flat. It's deep. It has a thing that can contain another thing that can contain another thing, and it can be infinitely nested. So model list was the wrong choice for that. So there was nothing in YUI that did what I needed. So I created a real tree data structure, and that was where I started. So the tree itself is actually a base-based class. It extends y.base, because you're probably not going to have more than a few tree views on the page. And if you do, you should rethink your life and go talk to a designer, because you're probably doing something wrong. So it's really useful for the tree to extend base because it has attributes, it has events. You need to have an initializer destructor lifecycle so you can clean it up after you're done with it. But for the tree nodes, these are just vanilla JavaScript functions. They expose properties and they have methods, but most of their functionality actually lives on that tree. And the thing that you do on the node just calls back up to the tree whenever it needs to do something. Events for adding and removing tree nodes, stuff like that, those are exposed on the tree, delegation style. So instead of subscribing to stuff on the node, you subscribe on the tree, and the tree tells you when something happens. And this means that the tree nodes themselves are super lightweight. They're super, super cheap. So you can create thousands and thousands and thousands of these, and the browser doesn't care. And you get a friendly, convenient API on each node, but the cost is so low that you're no longer in that territory of, because you're trying to do something the YUI way, it's actually unusable. Now this is usable, and you're not paying for something more than you should be. So the tree provides the underlying data structure, but it doesn't provide a UI. So on top of that, I created a tree view widget. Although actually it's not a widget in the sense that it doesn't extend y.widget. It's actually a view, because when I looked at what I needed from it, I realized I didn't need most of what y.widget was doing. And y.widget does really good stuff, but I didn't need a 3-step render lifecycle. I didn't need to parse a DOM structure. I didn't need height and width management. I didn't need to refire DOM events. I didn't need internationalization. I didn't need, there's a ton of stuff that it did that I didn't need. That's all good stuff, but for me, it would have been wasted code. Whereas what I did need was a DOM container. I needed a render method. I needed an easy way to attach events. And that's basically it. Everything else was going to be custom to my implementation. And it turns out that's exactly what y.view does. And I ended up not duplicating any code from y.widget, which tells me I probably made the right choice. So the end result is a tight, efficient component that doesn't have any wasted code. It doesn't have any wasted memory. It doesn't do things strictly according to the YUI way. But as a result, it's fast, it's efficient, and it exists. And we can use it. And most importantly, since I spent my time using the parts of YUI that made sense and that helped me, instead of fighting the parts of YUI that weren't helping me, it didn't take me forever to build this. And I actually really enjoyed building it. I didn't find it frustrating. So SmugMug also needed a menu widget. And we had been using the Node menu nav plugin in YUI, but it's pretty old. It's virtually unmaintained. And it didn't do most of the stuff that we needed it to do. So I set out to build this. And when I sat down to build it, I realized it's just a tree under the hood. A hierarchical menu is just a tree data structure. So I had already built most of it. All I had to do was slap a view on top of it to render the menu and to do stuff that's specific to a menu, like repositioning things if they're going to show up outside the viewport. And that was it. So instead of wasting my time fighting YUI again, I spent a week building an awesome menu widget and focusing on the things that mattered to my menu instead of trying to solve problems that I've created for myself by using parts of a library that I don't need. And then I started brainstorming, right? Because when you've got free time, I had finished my work, I had nothing to do, so of course I start thinking crazy thoughts. One of the drawbacks to my tree node approach is you make a trade-off. Because the tree nodes just have properties, you don't get change events when you change a property. And that's kind of unfortunate, but it's a nice trade-off for performance. But what if there were a super lightweight way to get notifications when I change a property, but without ballooning the cost of each tree node? So without using the full-fledged y.attribute. And it turns out there is. Again, Luke mentioned this in his talk yesterday. ECMAScript 5 introduced a feature called object.defineProperty. And it lets you do with JavaScript properties a lot of the stuff that you can do with YUI attributes. You can have getters and setters. You can make them read-only. And since this stuff is built into the language, you get it at virtually no cost. So all I really needed was a lightweight shim to handle IE 6, 7, and 8, which don't support this. And then I could probably have my cake and eat it too. So I built a component called y.property, which in good browsers exposes just a thin API over the native functionality. And then in those IE browsers that I mentioned, uses conditional loading to load an IE-specific shim that's still really small and just provides that same functionality without ES5. And so this isn't quite fully baked yet, but you can see the instantiation cost here is already significantly lower than attribute, to the point where it's something that you could probably consider using for a tree node that you might have thousands of. And it doesn't give you everything that attribute does. Attribute does a lot more than what property can do, but it gives you just the core stuff and just the stuff that I cared about for my tree nodes. So if you're interested in what this trade-off is and what stuff attribute does give you, I hope you got a chance to check out Luke's talk yesterday, and if you didn't, you should check out the video of that when it hits YUI Theater. So I haven't contributed the tree node or the menu or y.property back to YUI yet, because I'm not quite done with them, but I hope to. And SmugMug is already using these, and you can use them if you want to. We've got a fork of YUI 3 on GitHub where we maintain this stuff, so you can check that out there if you're interested. So I've given you a bunch of advice so far. I've told you to think twice before using YUI for everything. I've pointed out some parts of YUI specifically that you might want to avoid. I've recommended ignoring the YUI way when there's a simpler or better way to do things. But what if the simplest, fastest way to do something is not to use YUI, but to use another library? Should you port your application to that library? Should you stop using YUI and switch? I don't think so. I think that's a horrible idea. If your app is benefiting from YUI in certain areas, keep using YUI. Maybe your app in another area might benefit from another library, but YUI is not a religion. This isn't a zero-sum game. If you use another library for something that YUI doesn't do or doesn't do well, the YUI gods aren't going to smite you. You can use jQuery occasionally. It's OK. We won't judge you too much. So you probably shouldn't load another library alongside YUI to do stuff that YUI already does really well. That would just be wasteful. But if there's a gap in YUI's functionality, or if another library can help you do something better, I say use it. And there's a lot of this stuff out there now. Over the last few years, there's been an explosion in, some people call these things micro libraries, some people call them micro frameworks. I just call them libraries. But there's been an explosion in sort of single-use utilities. And some of them are crap, some of them are really, really good. And I don't think there's any reason not to use these when it makes sense. So one concern that people have is, YUI is really modular, and if I stick with YUI, I get dependency management. I don't have to worry about how to load stuff. I can load stuff from the Yahoo CDN. It's combo handled. If you want to pull in a third-party dependency, what a lot of people do is they'll manually wrap that dependency's JavaScript in a YUI.add call so that they can manage it as a YUI dependency. But then that adds maintenance cost for you, and you have to maintain that code yourself on your servers. You can't use a third-party CDN, and that's really kind of a pain. But it turns out there's actually a much easier way. YUI Loader will do this for you, and you don't have to do any special work, despite what you may think. So here's a simple example. Let's say that you're building something that needs some really fancy regular expressions. And there's this great library by a guy named Steve Levithan called xregex that implements a lot of regex functionality that's not available in the JavaScript language. But it's not a YUI module. You can load it from CDN.js, but it's not going to automatically work with YUI. But you can make it work. So this thing right here is a YUIConf object. And if you haven't used it before, you can pass in a configuration to your use call when you create a YUI instance. And you can configure all kinds of stuff about how YUI loads things and where it loads them from. So this is where custom module metadata lives, for example. And the first thing we need to do here to load our xregex library is just create a group to tell it the modules defined in this group are different from YUI core modules. Load them slightly differently. Don't use Yahoo CDN. Don't use a combo handler. Load these from CDN.js. And if you haven't heard of CDN.js, it's a community, hosted service for free CDN hosting for open source JavaScript libraries. So the next thing that we do after we've set up our base CDN.js group is we create a module for xregex, and we tell it, here's the path to xregex relative to our CDN base. Here's how you load this file. And it doesn't have any dependencies, so I haven't listed any requirements here. The tricky part is because we're loading this third-party code directly from a third-party server, it's not a YUI module, so YUI won't know about it. And that's why a lot of people wrap third-party code in a YUI.add call themselves. But you don't have to do that. It turns out we can cheat because YUI gives us this onProgress callback. And every single time a JavaScript or CSS file loads, YUI will call our callback. And this is triggered by the script and CSS load events from the browser. It's not specific to anything YUI related. And when YUI calls onProgress, it actually tells us the module name that was associated with whatever file just loaded. So we can see that our xregex file just finished loading. We can see that that module name was associated with the file that loaded. And we can dynamically create a YUI module to wrap xregex. And we haven't had to modify the code. We've just put a little bit of extra configuration in our YUI code. And YUI treats it just like any other module. So, you've got this module now that you can use in a use statement. Your other modules can depend on it. And YUI knows how to load it, just like core modules. So YUI wants you to succeed. It'll happily help you load third-party JavaScript onto your page and manage those dependencies just like anything else in YUI. So by all means, use YUI, but don't use more of it than makes sense. Be curious. Look at the source code. Sometimes you'll be pleasantly surprised, like I said. Sometimes you'll be horrified. But you'll always learn something. And before reaching for that screwdriver, consider whether you can unscrew that screw more efficiently with your hand, with the tools that you already have at your disposal natively. Luke said this yesterday, YUI and other libraries aren't magical. Magic is just more code. They're all using, all these libraries. They're using the same JavaScript engine that you have access to. Read the source of the libraries that you use. Learn how they work. Understand what they're doing for you. Understand what the cost-benefit trade-off is. And remember that your job is not to use YUI or to use another library. Your job is to make something awesome. Your users don't care whether this awesome thing has YUI under the hood or jQuery or Bootstrap or Dojo or Ember or whatever. They just care whether it's awesome. So don't be loyal to your tools. Be loyal to your users. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Ryan. Great talk. Any questions for Ryan?
No questions. Hey.
Right here. In the case of using a third-party library like jQuery or Dojo or Prototype or something like that that has completely different DOM accessor methods than YUI does, how do you keep that code base from getting really dirty?
I think that's really tricky. That's why I kind of stress the micro libraries and the micro frameworks. I think if you're going to load something, Prototype, Dojo, those older libraries that kind of came around the time that YUI did, or even before, they tend to be a little more monolithic. So they tend to include DOM management and effects and all that kind of stuff. So using something like that might not be the best choice. You might want to look for a smaller single-use library that does just what you need. Like I said earlier, I saw that underscore had something that I wanted, but it also had a ton of crap that I didn't want. So I ended up not using underscore. It would have been really nice, actually, if there were something that just did that templating piece, and then I could have just used that. But that's what I would recommend.
Thank you.
Over here.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on maintaining, having good maintainability of a code by offering kind of a easy to follow structure for developers as opposed to having all kinds of different frameworks and just plain JavaScript? Do you think that's also something to consider?
That's a really good question, and absolutely. I think that's part of the cost-benefit trade-off that you have to decide on. There is a huge benefit to having easy to read, easy to maintain code, and that's a big part of what libraries provide for you. And you pay a little bit for that. There's a cost usually in using an abstraction, but it's about deciding where the balance is. At what point does the cost start to outweigh the benefit? And that's why I stress, if it's easy for you to do something yourself, if it's not going to duplicate code, if it's not going to reinvent the wheel, then you could probably do it yourself without incurring maintenance cost or making things hard to read. But at the point where the library is doing a lot of useful stuff for you, then use the library, even if the cost is, even if it's going to slow down performance a little bit. I would tend to side on the side of making things more readable and more maintainable. Which is why I still used y.base, you saw, for my tree view. Even though I could have done the entire thing native and made it faster, I thought there was a good benefit to using base for the tree component. Other questions?
Hey.
Hey.
So, fantastic content. I love it. And I think that there were actually some points in there that my talk from yesterday, this is Luke, I guess.
That's Luke Smith.
Yeah, this is me. Hey. That actually work well together with what I was talking about yesterday, which in particular, there were a few examples of the use of ES5 directly, those setters and getters directly from ES5 for browsers that support that. And the development of y.property as being a closer shim to that. The two things that I think are really great about that is that it manages to preserve that abstraction of going through through a get and set method. It's just not implemented using attribute, it's implemented using property.
Right.
But then also there's the idea that now there is some work that validates the alternate implementation of that abstraction using that lighter shim that can potentially now displace some of what's in attribute and then make attribute faster. So,
Yeah.
in terms of the implementation improving invisibly, that's actually an example of that work, right?
Oh, you've proved my point wrong with my own things.
But
That's brilliant.
but no. So that wasn't the impetus of that. But I was saying that I'm glad you're doing it because now we can do that, right?
Yeah, I think that is a good
And
point.
so-
And it's my evil master plan, actually. I would love to see properties slide in under the core of attribute and provide that core stuff that they both do, and hopefully make attribute a little faster.
And actually, by doing so, I think you make a really good point, which is that the core team didn't do that, but you did that as a contributor. And so, to your point of don't count on the magic getting cheaper over time. If it's not getting cheaper over time, if you're feeling that weight, fix it.
Right, exactly.
Contribute that back into the library, and everybody benefits. I mean, there's a huge benefit to being a part of that, of the library and that community. So
Absolutely. That's how things get better. You can't just depend on the core team for every piece of innovation. I mean, these guys are busy.
Yeah.
And they're brilliant, but they're busy. They're not going to be able to do everything.
And also, isNumber does check for NaN. Because is
You're
finite
right, yeah.
checks
It checks
tests
for NaN, but I don't care about NaN. Who
I
cares
care about NaN. I hate NaN.
Other questions? Maybe one more?
Okay, thank you, Ryan.
All right, thank you guys.